Imagine waking up one morning to headlines announcing that Apple, the company famous for its closed ecosystem and tightly controlled hardware and software experience, has officially released its own Linux distribution. Not a fork hidden deep inside Mac OS, not a developer experiment, but a full consumer-facing operating system built on the Linux kernel, openly published, downloadable by anyone, and officially branded by Apple. At first glance, it sounds impossible, even contradictory, because Apple has always been the symbol of proprietary control, while Linux represents freedom, openness, and community-driven development. Yet when you start pulling at the threads of this idea, the scenario becomes less absurd and more fascinating. In fact, it opens the door to a radical rethinking of the future of desktop computing, open-source software, and Apple's role in shaping technology over the next several decades. To understand why this idea is so intriguing, you have to look at Apple's history and its relationship with Unix-like systems. Mac OS itself is already built on a Unix foundation, with Darwin at its core, which borrows heavily from BSD and other open-source projects. Apple has long relied on open-source software under the hood, even while presenting a polished, closed interface to users on top. The difference is that Apple traditionally keeps the user-facing layers proprietary and tightly controlled. Linux, on the other hand, is open all the way down to the kernel, with a culture that encourages modification, redistribution, and experimentation. If Apple were to release its own Linux distribution, it would not just be a technical decision, but a philosophical shift, one that could reshape how people perceive both Apple and Linux itself. In this hypothetical future, Apple's Linux distro would likely be born out of practical motivations rather than ideology. Apple is increasingly focused on custom silicon, efficiency, and long-term control over its platform. A Linux-based operating system could give Apple a flexible foundation for devices that don't neatly fit into the existing Mac OS or iOS categories. Think of augmented reality headsets, home automation hubs, automotive systems, servers, or even low-cost education devices. Linux already dominates many of these areas, and Apple engineers are undoubtedly familiar with it. By creating a distro tailored to Apple hardware and design principles, Apple could unify its software strategy across an even wider range of products, while still benefiting from the massive ecosystem of Linux drivers, tools, and developer knowledge. Now imagine what such a distribution would look like from the user's perspective. Apple is famous for design, consistency, and attention to detail, so this would not be a rough, terminal-heavy Linux experience aimed only at enthusiasts. Instead, it would likely feature a beautifully designed desktop environment, fluid animations, and a clean interface that feels instantly familiar to anyone who has used macOS or iPadOS. Underneath, however, it would be unmistakably Linux, with standard package managers, open system libraries, and compatibility with a vast range of existing Linux software. This combination could finally bridge the long-standing gap between Linux power and mainstream usability, something the Linux community has pursued for decades with varying degrees of success. Developers would be among the first to feel the impact of Apple's Linux distro. Apple already has a strong developer ecosystem, and combining that with Linux could be revolutionary. Developers could target a platform that offers the openness and flexibility of Linux, while also benefiting from Apple's development tools, documentation, and hardware optimization. Imagine Xcode, or a similar Apple toolchain supporting native Linux development out of the box, or Apple contributing directly to Linux kernel development to optimize performance on its own chips. This could accelerate innovation across the entire Linux ecosystem, as Apple's resources and engineering talent flow back into open-source projects. At the same time, this move would raise important questions about control and trust. Apple's brand is built on the idea that it knows what's best for users and enforces strict guidelines to maintain quality and security. The Linux world, by contrast, values user freedom, even when that freedom leads to complexity or instability. If Apple were to release a Linux distro, how much freedom would users really have? Would bootloaders be locked down? Would certain system components remain proprietary? Would Apple allow users to modify the system freely, or would it impose restrictions similar to those on iOS? These tensions would define how the community reacts to Apple's entry into the Linux space. One possible outcome is that Apple creates a hybrid model, where the core operating system is fully open source, but certain user-facing features and services remain proprietary. This approach would be controversial, but not unprecedented. Many Linux distributions already include proprietary drivers or software to improve user experience. Apple could argue that its closed components are necessary to deliver the level of polish and integration users expect. Critics, however, might accuse Apple of exploiting open source without fully embracing its values. The debate would be intense, and it would force the tech community to confront deeper questions about what openness really means in a world dominated by massive corporations. From a market perspective, Apple's Linux distro could dramatically alter the competitive landscape. Desktop Linux has always struggled to gain significant market share, not because it lacks power or flexibility, but because it lacks visibility and trust among mainstream users. Apple's involvement could change that overnight. Millions of users who would never consider installing Ubuntu, Fedora, or Arch might be willing to try a Linux-based system if it carries the Apple name and promises a smooth experience. This could lead to a surge in Linux adoption, benefiting not only Apple's distro, but the entire ecosystem, as more developers and companies begin to take Linux seriously as a desktop platform. This scenario would also put pressure on Microsoft and Windows. For decades, Windows has dominated the desktop market, especially in enterprise and gaming. Apple entering the Linux space could create a powerful alternative that combines the best of both worlds. The openness and flexibility of Linux with the usability and ecosystem strength of Apple. Enterprises might see this as an opportunity to reduce dependence on Windows while still offering employees a polished, well-supported system. Over time, this could erode Windows dominance and force Microsoft to further embrace open source and cross-platform strategies, something it has already begun to do. Gaming is another area where the impact could be profound. Linux gaming has made huge strides in recent years, thanks to technologies like Proton and Vulkan, but it still lags behind Windows in terms of compatibility and performance for many titles. If Apple were to invest heavily in Linux gaming as part of its distro, optimizing drivers, contributing to graphics APIs, and working with game developers, it could significantly improve the state of gaming on Linux. This would not only benefit Apple users, but also the broader Linux community, potentially making Linux a first-class gaming platform for the first time. Security and privacy would likely be central themes of Apple's Linux distro. Apple has positioned itself as a champion of user privacy, often contrasting its approach with that of data-driven companies. Linux, with its transparency and community oversight, aligns well with this narrative. By combining Linux's open architecture with Apple's security expertise, the resulting system could offer unprecedented levels of security and trust. Users could inspect the code that runs on their machines, while also benefiting from Apple's hardware-level security features. This could be especially appealing in a world increasingly concerned about surveillance, data breaches, and digital autonomy. However, this future would not be without risks for Apple. By embracing Linux, Apple would be stepping into a world where it does not have total control. The Linux kernel is governed by a global community, and decisions are made through consensus rather than corporate mandate. Apple would need to collaborate, compromise, and sometimes accept outcomes that do not perfectly align with its own interests. This could be a cultural shock for a company used to dictating the direction of its platforms. At the same time, it could also be an opportunity for Apple to redefine itself as a leader, not just in products, but in open collaboration. For the open source community, Apple's involvement would be both exciting and unsettling. On one hand, Apple's resources could accelerate development, improve documentation, and bring new users into the fold. On the other hand, there would be fears that Apple could dominate the ecosystem, steering development in ways that prioritize its own hardware and business goals. The challenge would be to ensure that Apple's participation strengthens, rather than undermines, the principles of open source. This would require vigilance, transparency, and a willingness to push back when necessary. In the long term, an Apple Linux distro could blur the lines between traditionally opposed philosophies of computing. The old dichotomy between closed and open, proprietary and free, could give way to a more nuanced spectrum. Users might no longer have to choose between a polished experience and full control over their systems. Developers might find themselves working in an environment that combines the best aspects of both worlds, and the tech industry as a whole might move toward a future where openness and commercial success are not seen as mutually exclusive. As this hypothetical future unfolds, one thing becomes clear. The idea of Apple making its own Linux distribution is not just a technical curiosity, but a powerful lens through which to examine the evolution of computing. It forces us to question long-held assumptions about brands, platforms, and values. It challenges the Linux community to think about accessibility in design. And it challenges Apple to think about openness and collaboration. Whether or not this scenario ever becomes reality, exploring it reveals how dynamic and interconnected the technology world has become. In the end, the most interesting aspect of this idea may not be what Apple would gain, but what users would gain. A future where the elegance of Apple's design meets the freedom of open-source software could empower a new generation of creators, developers, and everyday users. It could make computing more transparent, more adaptably, and more humane. And it could remind us that the most transformative innovations often emerge when seemingly incompatible ideas collide, forcing everyone involved to rethink what is possible.